I'm really delighted to be with you all here. This is my first trip to Arizona, not my first trip to the US. It's lovely to be here. I was saying that people in Arizona are very, very friendly. So it's been very nice to be here. It's a little warmer than it is in London. So we're in the middle of a good English summer. So it's been raining for about 5 days. So it's lovely to be reminded what the summer looks like. And it's great to be in the Episcopal Church. I was just saying to a few people during when I was going around the tables, my church, the Church of England, is currently in the middle of its General Synod, which is essentially like General Convention, but a bit more grumpy. And we meet twice a year, and we're in the middle of that now. And there's usually at least one day where there are fireworks in our General Synod, and today is that day. And I was saying how nice it was to wake up and that it had already happened. So I just caught up with the on social media afterwards and thought I'm glad to be there. And I'm not a member of General Synod, for which the bishops of the Church of England I think are delighted. But we are in a very interesting position in the Church of England, and I might just mention a little bit about that as we go through. Before we go any further, I might just say a little bit about myself, just only because I think context and the context in which we have these conversations matter. Thank you to Dean Troy for introducing me. My prime job, as it were, is a psychiatrist. I'm a jobbing psychiatrist in South London. I have a particular interest in forensic patients, in patients in that interface between prison or criminal justice system and mental health. And I have a research interest into psychopathy, which we can maybe talk about later if you like, but which is very helpful in managing church affairs. The role of psychiatry in my life is very important in my role as a priest. So I see the two things very much as part and parcel of the same vocation. I got ordained priest only a year and 2 weeks ago, which did not pass without difficulty. I was at the ordination of another curate in my parish just a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now. It was a week ago. It goes to show how fast things are going. It was a week ago, it's exactly a week ago. And I realised that I was feeling quite anxious in the building, and I couldn't work out why. And it's because a year ago there were people threatening to disrupt my own ordination, including our needs to inform the kind of civil authorities that there may be trouble at the ordination service because of being a gay person, not for any other reason. So the Church of England is in an interesting place, and that's the church in which I minister. I minister in the Church of England in a diocese called Southwark, which is I've described to some people as the fun side of London. It's the south of London, north of London, where the Diocese of London gets all the fancy stuff. You get some halls, you get the coronation, you get all of that kind of stuff going on. The Diocese of Southwark is where the real deal is, where proper ministry is taking place. The Diocese of London will not agree with that, of course. But we're a diocese which has a range of types of church. So from charismatic to very Catholic, we've got churches with very different types of theology, from very conservative to very progressive. But we all seem to live together in a pretty reasonable way, sort of, most of the time. So it's lovely to be with you here. And it's lovely to talk a little bit about something which is dear to my heart. So I wrote this book, which some of you very kindly bought, to try and add something a bit different to the conversation about sexuality and gender within the context of the church. And I'll talk a little bit about that specific something today, rather than going over old ground that many of you will know about in terms of the conversations, debates, arguments, and sort of about sexuality and gender in the church. As I said, my context is one in which we are nowhere near where you are in terms of the way that we've had the conversations and the way that the conversations have ended. And in the Church of England at the moment, I cannot get married to my partner or I would lose my job. And I have to stay for time celibate, otherwise I would lose my job. So those two are requirements to clergy in the Church of England. And we are forbidden by law, as in the law of England, not just church law, from performing marriages of people of the same sex or gender. So that's where the Church of England is at the moment. You might want to talk about that sort of thing. Those of you who are interested, the book covers a little bit of information on the English situation, particularly as it is now. We're hoping it might change in the next few months. I also just wanted to state at this point, many of you would have probably caught up with, maybe not, the goings on at the Lambeth Conference of last year. So the meeting of bishops from around the world. The Anglican Communion website describes it as a meeting of bishops representing X number of million people in the world. It's not my understanding that bishops represent anybody. Instead, it is a meeting of the bishops who turned up on that day and came up with whatever policy they came up with. And that is important because one of the things which sits around lots of discussions about same-sex relationships, same-gender relationships, about gender and sexuality more widely in the Church across the Anglican Communion is something called Lambeth Resolution 110, which was passed at the 1998 Lambeth Conference, and for which, when the Episcopal Church committed to allowing a bishop in a same-sex relationship to be ordained, and indeed permitted same-sex marriage in church, or marriage of people of the same sex in church, or same gender in church, you got put on the naughty step for doing so, because you went against Lambeth Resolution 110. Lambeth Resolution 110 essentially says that the Anglican Communion does not feel that they can commend blessings of people of the same sex or gender. And if you go against that, you're going against the mind of the Communion. I mention this because another thing that Lambeth 110 mentions is a commitment to opposing homophobia in all its forms. Now, I think it's probably fair to say that calling homosexuals a virus is not necessarily a commitment to that part of Lambeth 110, that's the Archbishop of Nigeria, or indeed the Archbishop of Uganda using the Easter Day message, not somewhat controversially to refer to the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, but instead to ask the President of Uganda to pass a law that would criminalise homosexuality in Uganda. So the Anglican Communion is in a very difficult place, and the first thing I want to say today is that your role as TEC, as the Episcopal Church, within the Anglican Communion, is of a fundamental importance to many of us who are in churches that are not where you are. And it is also a fundamental importance, and we know this from testimony from people in places where civil society and the church, in support of civil society, are not very good on queer issues. Your witness is enormously important. The people who are consistently forgotten about in debates about queer issues across the world are queer people in countries where they are criminalised and potentially risk execution for existing, not necessarily even for doing. And the church has been complicit, that is the Anglican Church, members of the Anglican Church, including bishops of the Anglican Church, have been complicit in pushing for legislation that will lead to extremely bad outcomes for queer people, particularly queer people of colour across the world. So it's thank you for your witness and your prophetic voice as TEC, and please don't forget us when you're seeking a way forward. Please do not let the Anglican Communion get away with it. You are just as much a member of it as anyone else, and your witness to it and within it is absolutely fundamental if we're going to make any difference or change in the wider church. One thing I also wanted to mention at the beginning is the sheer level of instrumentalisation of people, so the use of people as means rather than ends in themselves that we've seen in debates on queer issues. Some of us here will be LGBTQ, some of us won't be. Those of us who are will almost be so used to being used as tools or as discussion points that we sometimes forget that it's happening to us. One of the very interesting things in the English situation is we've heard a lot about how debates about queer people are really good for the church because they're about finding good ways of living together with difference. Now that may well be true. It may be that this is something about which we need to learn to live together with each other with difference. The problem is that immediately others queer people. So the first kind of substantive thing I wanted to say today, in a sense, is please be careful of the language when we're talking about queer people. We're not actually talking about issues at all. There are elements of abstract theory and so on that sit within these conversations, but actually we're talking about people. One of the bishops who I've been working with on the Church of England's guidance on same-sex relationships said naively, not maliciously, said naively, I don't want this to be a simple binary. We need to learn to live with one another. And I said to him, the problem is, Bishop, the binary is whether I get sacked or not. So there are binaries for queer people, and it depends who is holding the binary in these conversations. Is it the queer people? So are we forced to live with the binaries, or is the church having to learn that those binaries need to sit with them? So for an example from our context, the bishops have now agreed that there will be I think the exact phrase is a wide theological and ecclesial space, i.e. we'll be able to disagree with one another and we won't punish anybody. That for me is a picking up of the binary away from the queer people and picking it up as a church and saying, we're not quite sure about all of this, but we're not going to punish you and we're not going to put it on your head. But the problem is, when I spoke to the bishop about that, he hadn't even conceived that that was a problem. So we are often seen as abstract concerns, and as I wrote in the book, it's easy to do that when you're a bishop. You get in your car, you say to me or to others, calm down, dear. It's a slow process, the church works slowly. You get in your car and you go home to your wife and kids. Whereas I go home, and if I do the wrong thing at the wrong time or say the wrong thing at the wrong time, if I was employed by the church, I'd lose my house, my partner, So what I want to do today a little bit is rethink some of those assumptions around how we have these conversations or how we engage with matters of LGBTQI inclusion, and think about what queer people in particular are bringing to a church conversation beyond issues of sex, beyond issues of relationship, and yet entirely within those issues as well. So what can queer people and our experience and our existence even are calling to be awkward? What can that do to enhance the life of the church more widely? One of the things I think we always need to ask ourselves in church conversations about anything is, what are we afraid of? What is it that we're scared would happen if this decision was made? Or if something would happen, or if something went against us? What are we afraid of? And just as importantly, what are they afraid of? And we can always other people. In the Church of England's General Synod, conservative evangelicals on one side and conservative Catholics on the other side are both in firm agreement that we must not bless same-sex relationships. And yet they disagree with each other on everything else. And yet on this issue, there can be common ground. So we can other people depending on where we sit, depending on a whole group of different issues. And one of the groups of people that have been othered in debates and discourse around same-sex relationships, same-gender relationships in the context of the Anglican Communion are the Global South. We've often had the Global South thinks this, which is a fascinating way of describing millions of people in one sentence. There is no such thing as the Global South view on this, much as there is no such view as the Global North view on this. But what are we afraid of as ourselves? What are other people afraid of? And how are they using other people or ourselves? How are we using other people to get in the way, to act as a barrier in where we're afraid of other people? One of the really interesting things that's changed in conversations around sex and relationship, and it's happened in this country and also in the UK and more widely, is that we've moved away slightly from, and this we're talking in hundreds of years, we moved away from the purpose of marriage being about procreation. So that was the kind of classic argument. You read the church fathers, you read through the kind of history of the church. much up until the Reformation, even beyond that, the debates have been on procreation. And what we mean by procreation is the biological begetting of children between the two people in the marriage, usually with no additional technological means. So just, we mean what goes where, when, and producing a child. And that's been the argument for marriage for years. And that remains the argument in many of our historical movements as Anglicans, as Episcopalians. I prefer to call myself an Episcopalian here, because I know that there's a difference between calling oneself an Anglican in the American context. So, and as Episcopalians, as members of the same Anglican Church, and the Book of Common Prayer talks about marriage as being about the begetting of children, about the avoidance of carnal lusts and various other ways of describing it, and then about mutual comfort. And of course, in modern society, we move towards actually talking more about mutual comfort, less about avoiding bad behaviour, but more about joy of sexual union. There's no joy of sexual union in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. None. Zero. Sex is bad. It's very Augustinian. It comes from St. Augustine's fear of sex. Although St. Augustine himself is quite messed up on that whole topic. And inconsistent. And then we talk about the begetting or procreation of children. I want to think a little bit towards the end of what I talk about today, about what procreation might mean beyond simply the producing of children. But we move beyond that concept of the production of children towards this kind of gender complementarity argument. So the argument that's now mostly put in opposition to same-sex, same-gender marriage is that people in that Jesus talks about the necessity for there to be a male and a female in marriage, making a reference to the Genesis narrative. I won't go into all of that now because A, it's boring and B, it's wrong, but essentially Jesus is asked a question by someone trying to trick him in St. Matthew's, and also it's found in St. Mark's Gospel as well. St. Matthew's Gospel is asked a question about trying to trick him about divorce. It's about you heterosexuals, by the way. It's not about people in the same-sex, same-gender relationships. It's about heterosexuals wanting to divorce. But it's so easy to other this and make it someone else's problem, produce same-sex relationships as the scapegoat. But it's about divorce, and Jesus says, have you not heard? And then refers to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 2, I think, primarily. And says, have you not heard that God created a male and female, he created them, that man should be to his wife? All of that. And the argument then comes, well, therefore, marriage is about clinging to one another. We need gender complementarity for that. Therefore, what Jesus says about marriage is that it must be between a man and a woman, which even for some of the people who put forward this point of view is a pretty impressive piece of medical acrobatics. That Jesus says that marriage is between a man and a woman because he makes reference to a Genesis narrative, which doesn't make reference to same-sex relationships at all. And one of our key proponents in the debate in England about this talks about how Jesus is very clear that marriage is between a man and a woman, which I find astounding. But anyway, so that's where the arguments have gone to. It's all about gender complementarity. And so one of the things we need to think about, particularly those of us who are in favour of the involving people in the life of the church, involving people, involving relationship, making relationship a key element of involvement in the life of the church, is saying, so what can we speak to about complementarity? Do we think that gender is the key part of marriage, for example? And actually, if I might be a bit more blunt about it, do we mean that biological sex is key to marriage? Because actually, if we go back to the procreation element, are we basically saying that you need a particular form of anatomy in order to be married? Is that what complementarity is all about? Now, there are lots of arguments we could make that look at the fact that it's not actually, the Genesis narrative is not actually about difference at all. It's about similarity. Man is made and then has to have something similar enough to man in order to live together. And how does that help? There's all kinds of arguments about gender equality we could go into, but I'm not going to go into now. But the misuse of that word helper is astounding. The helper that is referred to in Genesis 1 is not someone that comes and carries the bags. It is the person that word isn't often used to refer to God being the helper. So it is it is actually someone in a higher authority, not in a lower authority. But we can dig into that another day, perhaps. But what do we mean by complementarity of individuals? Where do we find that complementarity? Or rather, do we think the word complementarity is actually helpful at all? What is it about that relationality between two people that makes marriage, marriage? And indeed that makes relationship, relationship? And just as importantly, what is it about that that reflects something of God? Because that's, if we get down to it, if we want to Christianize marriage at all, that's what we've got to say is happening. Otherwise, marriage is a perfectly fine secular civil experience. It's good for law, it lets you get your house, if your partner dies, if your husband or wife dies, it allows you to have medical visiting rights. There are all loads of good reasons to have marriage beyond the theological, beyond the Christian. But what is it about marriage that makes it Christian? Why did the church take on marriage as its own? Again, the history of marriage, we're constantly told that marriage was the church's first. It wasn't. Basic reading of history. Again, often there's a mistake made between facts and opinions. So here's a fact. Marriage did not belong to the church in the beginning. That's a fact. Yet we hear that it did. But why did the church think marriage was important enough? Why do Christians think that this union of two people is important enough? Is the centrality of that about there being male and female or not? And for me, I can't see why that is the defining fact, the defining part of marriage, if we move beyond arguments of procreation, which even those who oppose same-sex relationships have done. Otherwise, we wouldn't marry people, like in some circumstances the Roman Catholic Church will not. We would not marry people who were sterile and who could not have children. So, in the topic of this lecture, I spoke about why we should move beyond tolerance and why we should move beyond inclusion. For me, tolerance and inclusion have been the two buzzwords for queer issues, basically for the last 50 to 60 years. We hear it in the UK, still in church circles, although less in society. People still talk about pride as being unnecessary because we've already got inclusion. I don't know whether you have that narrative here, but we certainly have that narrative. Why do you need all this pride? You're already included. My problem with the word inclusion is that it is suggesting that it is for others to take this group of people and decide that they are part of the club. The Christian radical reality, particularly from a Eucharistic perspective, when we think of going to the Eucharist with communion, is that God's already done the deciding. So it's not actually for us at all to do the ins and the outs, which changes everything. The way that we formulate and think about inclusion, and that's not just about queer issues, it's about issues of race, issues of gender, issues of disability, all of these things, and there's plenty more. All of these things start still from the perspective of us deciding who's in and who's not. We are an inclusive church because we welcome these people. You're not welcoming those people, they're already part of it. And when you see what Jesus does in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't bring people into the centre. Jesus goes to the periphery and hangs about. And as a church, and as a church, big C and small c, as an institutional church, and as people who belong to the church, we're desperate to bring people in to what we have. And we're not so keen to ask whether what we have is actually the church. So I'm not a big fan of inclusion. I think probably more people, I'm a fan of inclusion, I don't like that being how we describe what we're doing. And I think also the concept of tolerance is a risky one. Because if you tolerate something, what that really means is that you don't really think it's on, but you kind of allow them to come to dinner. And if we're going to do that, we need to have a think about why inclusion and tolerance are not the words that we need to focus on. I'm going to stop in a few minutes. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the theological reasons why I think this is important, then I'll give you a bit of time to chat, and I'm going to eat, and then I'll do a little bit further on looking to the future. So, I think this matters, as I said, theologically. I think equality legislation is really important, and it is so amazing. I was in the Diocese of Missouri not that long ago, and to see the Diocese of Missouri clergy heading up sort of arguments and protests and so on in favour of trans rights was the most extraordinary thing I've seen. The idea that we would have diocesan officers doing that officially in England is just, it is completely beyond anything I could possibly imagine. Totally and utterly beyond anything I could imagine. So watching that was just, I genuinely thought at the beginning that was not true. That's the level of difference between us. So it's important, equality legislation matters, and the Church's role in engaging with equality legislation and focusing on the civic and civil elements is important. In England, we have specific get-outs from the Equalities Act as a church, which is an interesting place to sit as a church. But I think there are theological grounds for why all this matters, and I've started to talk about some of those already. But I think we need to hold two things together, one of which is equity in society. So think not just about equality, but thinking about equity, so actually giving people the same opportunities, actually enabling people who otherwise would be disabled by society to do particular things. Equity is a key civic thing that we should be arguing for, but our equity in civic society is grounded in our theological understanding of equality under God. So we start with all are made equal, created equal. Your constitution almost gets there, but doesn't quite. So all are created equal. If I just criticise the American Constitution, I'd probably be immediately removed from the country. But we start with equality under God. Radical equality under God, and it hurts because each time we find equality under God, we find a reason for why it's not quite the case. And yet, that's our starting point, and that leads us to an understanding of equity in human society. My starting point in this book, lots of people call me a revisionist in England, which is a fun way of calling me someone who doesn't believe in the Bible. One of those fun phrases that you will have here as well, I'm a Bible-believing Christian, and I kind of think, well, what am I then? But I'm not told that I'm not a Bible-believing Christian, but I just ignore the Bible. That's just Google. It's rubbish. And there's 2 chapters in this book which explain why that's not the case. So I think our understanding of Christian life cannot ignore the Bible. It just can't. I think there are 3 ways of reading Holy Scripture. It's incredibly simplistic, and I develop it a bit more in the book, but there's 3 simple ways when you come to a passage which makes you uncomfortable, particularly around issues of LGBTQI people. One of which is the same to this passage. This passage is absolutely right, and we can ignore the context and everything else. This is talking to our context right now. There's nothing good in the Bible about same-sex relationships, and therefore same-sex relationships are bad. There's nothing good that it says about same-sex activity, terrible phrase, and therefore it's wrong, and in every circumstance. That's one way of reading them. The other way of reading this game is going to ignore those when they like them. I don't think that's very helpful either. Although, reading through some parts of Scripture, there are parts of Scripture which don't necessarily relate to this topic, which when you hear them read in morning, evening prayer, or unfortunately at the daily Eucharist, and you hear them and you think, oh, I'm not quite sure I want to hear that, we need to do some serious work with them, and we need to ask whether we are producing a church that understands what it's doing and talking about when we read these scriptures in such short passages during short services. An example was one weekday mass I was presiding at a church, and I looked out to the congregation. It was full of women, no men at all, just me. All the rest were women, and I was reading from Ephesians. And the first reading was Ephesians, women submit to your husbands as the Lord. And I thought, oh, great. So I gave a little homily. We're not used to giving homilies, and my vicar wasn't very happy, because if you give a homily at one service, then they expect it at every service. So, which is what I was told afterwards. But I thought, I can't just let this go. So I gave the homily on and sort of put the passage in context and so on. And then the second passage, the second day was giving a homily, giving a reading again from Ephesians, slaves submit to your masters. I looked out to my congregation. My congregation is about 60-70% from the Caribbean, West Africa. I looked out to the congregation and thought, I can't let this go. I cannot let this passage be read simply and then go up to the altar and celebrate the Lord's Supper. So there are times when you have to be a bit more careful with some of these things, and you have to develop them and put them in context and so on. And that's the third way of reading Scripture, which is putting Scripture into context and thinking about how and why we do and understand what we say. And that is taking the Bible seriously, much more than trying to find simplistic answers from it. Okay, I've got a notice from the back saying it's 12 o'clock, which means I think I should stop. So I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then we can have a break. So there are three things I want to kind of talk about in terms of the theological arguments that we need to, and these theological arguments are not to kind of beat our opponents with them, to say, although I think it's important for Episcopalians, even if you've sorted it in your own house, there are plenty of other houses where this hasn't been sorted. In my father's house, there are many rooms, many mansions. There are, and we need to go and knock on those doors as well. But I want to talk these because they actually fundamentally change what we think about as the church as well, who we are as a church. And for those of us who are affirming, to use the phrase progressive on this issue, we haven't always done the theological work to work out why we're affirming, we just know we are. And that theological work can be quite uncomfortable because it can change how we think about who we are as well. So the first one, and I've written down here, which is my usual inability to write in plain English, it's a fundamental challenge to heteronormative Christian anthropology. By which I mean, this is the existence, the mere existence of people who are attracted to people of the same sex or gender, the mere existence of people who are intersex, who might have sexual characteristics of male and female together, or some males and female or indeterminate. The mere existence of transgender folk, the mere existence of the fact that we only know about the X and Y chromosome in the last century. So we talk a lot about, well, this person's male, this person's female, and we say, well, it's clear because they're genetics of X and Y. Well, that's fine, but how do we know about all the people in the Bible because we don't know any of their genetics? But the mere fact that we have such people, people like me, people like some people in this room, that exist, challenges what we say about who we are as human beings. And it moves us away from the idea that being and it usually is a white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual, opposite sex attracted, if we're going to use that phrase, person, moving away from that being the normative, moving away from that being what God really meant to create, and everything else is a kind of sideshow. If we move away from that, that changes everything that we can say about humankind. Because we don't always have to relate it to that heteronormative, that individual, that white male, straight male perspective. So, one of the key things that we need to do differently, for example, is talk about sexuality within that context differently. For example, in South London, where I live, and probably here too, if you walk down the road holding the hand of somebody, in the great majority of cases, they think there's something romantic going on, sexual, romantic, hormones. Not always, because friends can hold hands as well. Between boys, it's less usual. Between girls, it's more usual, but that's not absolutely the case. But that would be seen as a kind of romantic or sexual act to some degree, or indicative of something sexual or romantic. I've done quite a bit of travel in the west coast of Africa. If I was in Gambia and holding someone's hand with the same sex, that would not be seen as sexual. And in fact, it would be absurd in many ways for that to be a sexual act. It's an act of friendship and so on. All of which is to say that there is a context element to everything that we meet in life, everything that we see in life. All of our actions, the way that we are as human beings is contextually derived to some degree. Which includes sex. Now, there are certain parts of sex which are not contextually derived, so we can be pretty clear about those. I remember asking one of my chaplains at college, when I was doing in university, I said, who had a very conservative perspective, I said, well, what is sex then? You tell me what it is. And he came up with a pretty usual answer, when one thing goes in another thing. And you say, okay, fine, that's fine. And I said, what we're talking about there is kind of procreative sex, or reproductive sex. Yes, that's fine. I said, well, we're not really worried about that in the context of same-sex or same-gender relationships in the great majority of cases. So we need to worry about that. If that's what sex is, then it's not happening anyway. Oh, no, that's not really what I meant. Okay, go back and tell me what you did. Came back. And in the end, his own answer was, it's what you wouldn't do with a friend. Which I thought for a chaplain in the University of Cambridge was a slightly naive answer. But nonetheless, it was interesting because it began to make clear the importance of context in what we're understanding as a sexual or a romantic act. Mm-hmm. And actually, it's not about what goes where, when, and how. It's about what this means as much as about what this is. Back to our understanding of individuals as human beings. What we're saying when we're saying that people of the same sex or same gender cannot have sex with one another, cannot have sexual relationships with one another, is not just that they cannot have sex with one another, we're also saying that they may not, i.e. that God says that they may not do that. And we also would be saying that because of our understanding of what sex is in relationship back to what we were saying at the beginning, relationship to God and God's relationship to humankind and so on, actually we're saying that that kind of sexual relationship does not reflect or cannot reflect something of God's relationship with humankind, or whatever else it is that we're saying that sexual relationships do point towards. We're not saying that people may not have sex with someone of the opposite sex. We're saying that they cannot, in that they cannot reflect something of God's relationship with humankind. Which actually means that we're saying that those people, and we know now that sexuality is not chosen and all of these things, I don't need to go through all of those arguments. What we're actually saying is those people are in some way deficient, in some way unable to express or to show or to reflect God. Which is actually a question of human or of anthropology, about what we're saying about the human person, and not a question about what goes where, when, and how, whether God likes it or not. Because what we're actually saying is it is impossible for someone who is attracted to someone of the same sex or gender to reflect something of God. That, for me, is a very strong position for us to take. And that, in many ways, is a very strong position which, for me, throws the whole thing over. Because I cannot look at people who are attracted to someone of the same sex and gender and say that they are not reflecting something of the love of God in what they're doing. I can't. By the fruits of what we see, by the way that they are with one another, by the similarity, not the difference between that and what people of opposite sex and gender are showing in their relationship. I cannot say that. In all honesty, I can't put my hand on my heart and say that. And yet, that is what we must do if we are saying that same-sex relationships are wrong. It's not about whether you may or may not do something, it's about the fact that you can or cannot do something as a human being. And my understanding is we were all created in the image and likeness of God. And if we're all created in the image and likeness of God, that's a very strong claim to be making. I'm going to break there. And I think one of the things that's really struck me doing more and more reading on this is how much we have decided that married life is the key to salvation as a church. Which is why someone said to me a while back at a talk, and it's stuck with me ever since. So all that you're interested in really is for two men to be able to get married. And actually that's not the case. And I hope that I kind of made that fairly clear today, but we have obsessed about marriage as being almost the idealized form of how we get saved, how we enter salvation as people, despite the fact that Jesus is not married, despite the fact that Paul may or may not have been married, and certainly isn't too keen on it. And yet that has become, particularly since the Reformation, our sole understanding of what being redeemed, or part of the story of redemption for us as human beings is. And so I do think, and of course marriage being a secular institution in itself, it's fascinating that has become so central to our understanding. And I think you're right, and I think in a sense we need to pull ourselves back, firstly to asking what is saved in the coming of Jesus Christ. So some of think it's some of our Eucharistic prayers talk about, which is slightly different to yours. We don't have the Star Wars prayer that you have, the one about all the universe, which I love. I wish we had that one. But I think one of ours talks about all creation being redeemed, or certainly in some of our writing, and that debate through Christian history about what is redeemed or who is redeemed. Is it humankind? Is it creation? What's the second coming look like? And that's, again, a conversation for another day. But what does this mean? What does redemption mean for the human person? And I suppose my argument through much of this is that until we recognise that the human person is not... I always think about this in science. There's no normal. We talk about normal because various traits are more likely to be found in most people. So therefore, but for the normal in Christian understanding, the normal becoming the normative, i.e. what we should be, has always been a problem. We've always tended towards this normative understanding. And the normative understanding, back to what I was saying before, is a white man. And that's through Christian history. And so therefore we almost get to the stage where we think about salvation in terms of, well, the white man is what Jesus was, of course, which is not the case. But the white man is what Jesus was because that's what we've kind of convinced ourselves is the case. And that's what salvation looks like. And the white man usually is married, so therefore and we build our anthropology of salvation, our understanding of the humanity of salvation on this model, which is not the model presented to us in Scripture. And so I think that's a very long way of saying, yes, I think that is probably one of the fears. And yes, it's one that the Church is fundamentally terrified about engaging with, because we would rather make more people white men than we would recognise that becoming a white man is not necessary for salvation. Yeah. Hopefully that answers it. Shall I continue? Shall I blabber on a bit more and then let you have another chat? Okay. Are there any other burning things that people want to raise? No. Okay. So I want to just pick up on some of the other arguments I've made in this book, but not go into them in huge amounts of detail because that will tempt you to buy the book. And I might as well plug that there's another one coming out called Queer, which just picking up on that last one, called Queer Redemption. Why queerness changes everything you knew about the church, or you thought you knew about the church. And just picking up on some of those questions that, if this is the case, that changes a lot about what we understand about ourselves. It's not written yet, but it is coming out. I hope. So I spoke a little bit about anthropology, about what that means to us as human persons, able to reflect something of God, which we would hope is the case as being Christians. I want to also think a little bit about experience, and in the book I talk a little bit about experience. I think I'm probably an honorary Methodist, in that I think that experience sits alongside tradition, reason and Scripture as one of the ways that we are able to talk about or engage with God. I actually don't think that there's a three-legged stool argument that's often made that Hooker came up with, that you had three legs on a stool, which was theology and one of which was Scripture, tradition and reason. I don't think that's very helpful, and also Hooker never said it either. But I think we read Scripture through different lenses, and I think one of those lenses is reason, one of them is experience, and one of them is tradition, and I think it's helpful for us to do that, and also know that we're doing it. You can't read the Bible without interpretation, you can't read the Bible without biases. You can just know whether you're reading it with them or not, or it makes that you're reading it with them or not. And I think that's one of the key things that we don't do. I'm not honest about. But in the book, I kind of looked at what it looks like when we don't, or when we're not open to people of the same sex or same gender, falling under one another and also being ourselves, when we don't recognise them as part of the ecology of human existence. And I talk about it on the individual sense, so how it impacts us as individuals. Many of us have had our own struggles through this. I've been fairly unscathed really by same-sex conversion therapy, but if you talk to people who've been through it, it's horrendous. And the kind of the repression that we put on ourselves as individuals, and all of us have a level of repression in our lives. Some of us know it, some of us don't, and those of us who are queer in some way will have, whether we like it or not, we will never be quite free from the way that society and others, and indeed ourselves, have impressed on ourselves and not quite where we should be. So there's the individual level, but there's also the impact on institutions, particularly the church. So I cover this in one of the chapters in the book, looking at the way that it's particularly impacted my own church, both in terms of how we exist as a church, but also how we exist outwards as a church, so how we do mission, how we understand ourselves as a church, on the way that we read the scriptures, on the way that we understand ourselves, and examples of this might be the false celibacy that I've spoken about, the fact that in the Church of England there is one gay bishop. Of course, that's not true. There are plenty. I know. I've had dinner with them. They've told me. I'm not in the business of outing them, but we've got to a situation where in the Church of England, none of the bishops will admit in public to being anything other than heterosexual. They might write it in documents that say some amongst our number or whatever, but they'll never admit to it themselves. And the most egregious, and I think sinful, I'm willing to use the word, experience of this was when one bishop was about to be outed by one of our more dear newspapers, and they just came out, just admitted to being in a relationship with another man. When he did that, not a single one of the other bishops who is gay stood up and was counted. 0. Now, for me, that is a grotesque level of dishonesty and hypocrisy, but it's not just about bishops. I often have with bishops. I'm not we get on, but I'm not their greatest fan in many ways, and they're certainly not mine. But it's not actually about bishops, it's about the church culture that we produce that allows that to happen. That means that bishops would rather not or feel unable to speak about themselves in honesty. They ask us to speak about ourselves in honesty, but they won't do it for themselves. That's a terrible environment that we've created as a church. And that's all of us in many ways, as a church. That in the Church of England, the bishops do not feel able to be honest. Of course, the problem is that the same people who are making the rules at the moment on same-sex relationships are the ones who have studiously refused to talk about it. Because the only way to become a bishop in the Church of England is to have no position on this. And so therefore, the people who have studiously had no position on this are now having to make decisions on this. So we're not in a very healthy place. But so it has a big impact on us as an institutional church, but that also says a lot about who we are as Christians, who we are as people of Christ living together in an institution, that we won't and cannot have these conversations. I also speak in the book a bit about the arguments around science, and we've covered some of those, thinking about doing theology about what is rather than what we prefer existed. But the minute that you firstly recognise, as I've said, that XY is new as an understanding, and secondly that XY does not equal male, even on its most basic biological sense, certainly across the whole of creation, we enter into a place where those easy binaries of yes but become much more difficult. And if we want to do a theology that is based on something that isn't true, is objectively unverifiable factually, that's fine, it's just rubbish. So we shouldn't be doing it, but yet we continue to do that. And we need to challenge that, I think, as a church. So I think that many of our churches, including the Church of England, are grossly out of step, not just with society, but with reality. And so actually one of the things that we're called to, I think, as Christians, is to consistently draw ourselves back to what we know about the world, i.e. in science and discovery, is a gift from God as well as a challenge to us, but it should never be something we fear. If we start fearing science, if we start fearing human discovery, then we're in a very strange place as Christians, because God gives us our human faculties and gave us reason. If God didn't want us to do science, there are plenty of ways to prevent us from doing it. But we have been given the ability to do it, and yet our fear of it remains beyond this question into many other parts of life. And our arrogance as church bodies to recognise that people might know more than us about factually, might be able to understand things differently to us, is astounding. And I think we saw some of that in the last couple of years in response to COVID and various other things. Certainly in my context, I can't speak to yours on that. I spoke about the beginning about needing to know what people are scared of. I think we need to know more widely about what the grounds of the opposition are, and we need to name the grounds of opposition in wider society, particularly as a church that is affirming, and actually to demand that people engage with these questions in integrity and honesty instead of presenting pseudo-religious perspectives. So, for example, those of you who spend your evenings reading philosophy might have read Martha Nussbaum's book on disgust, the politics of disgust in the context of the same-sex marriage legislation in the US. If you don't spend your evening reading philosophy, I salute you. But also, don't worry, because I am not a philosopher of any sort, and I found it an easy read. It's genuinely, unusually, a book that you could actually read that says things which are philosophical. It's an extraordinary experience that many of my colleagues at Cambridge would do well to learn. It's really worth reading, because it speaks about how important disgust has been through most of this. It's disgust, concepts of othering, and concepts of moving beyond Martha Nussbaum's book, moving towards concepts of scapegoating, the idea that actually same-sex relationships are in many ways acting as a proxy for something that we don't like in ourselves. There are so many reasons that people have opposition to same-sex and gender relationships, to people who are transgender. Actually, getting people, and some of us have included ourselves, because we all hold these views inside ourselves, even if we don't express them. Getting ourselves to ask ourselves, why do we feel this? What is it that's actually at the bottom of this, rather than just saying what God says? God doesn't say. Even the most conservative scholars will, apart from some of our great friends on the General Synod of the Church of England, I'm not sure I describe them as scholars, but even our greatest scholars, conservative scholars, will not say God says X in many cases. It will be their interpretation of what God has spoken through the Bible and so on. Force people to do that work. Force people to do that work, whether that's in your own congregations. Sometimes you'll have people who say, well, I really support, pride, because I think it's really important, but I'm just a bit funny about. If people come to you with that, that's often people reaching out trying to ask you to help them to come to, or to think these things through. And often it comes to people like us, like to LGBTQI people. It's like, that seems to be our little special treat. But it comes to us to have to answer those questions. Or go and speak to X because they're gay, and you're like, great. And actually, one of the things, when we talk about allyship a little bit, one of the things which is great is that allies, or people who are not themselves directly impacted by this in their own person, to actually do the hard work. Because a lot of us are really tired of it. And I don't mind doing it, because I like talking, and I like talking to people about this kind of stuff. But there's a lot of people for whom this is so painful, and just so difficult. And you don't have to be queer to understand some of this stuff. Don't speak for us, because that really doesn't help. But please speak with us and learn what could be and could not be helpful to speak to people, because there is so much that can be done by people with a good heart and an open heart, but are willing to do some of the hard work for us. So expanding our shoes is really very helpful. So I want to talk a little bit then, as we kind of move towards the end, about this allyship. So there's an absolutely fabulous racial justice campaigner in the UK called Elizabeth Henry. I haven't warned her that I mentioned her, but anyway, she'll be telling you later. And Elizabeth was the racial justice advisor for the Church of England and resigned. In many ways, she felt that the Church of England was not making the progress it needed to make. And Elizabeth is a great friend of our parish and a great intersectional person. She works hard on educating people not only on issues of race, but also issues of gender and sexuality and so on. And Elizabeth, we did not in the plug, we did a series of Lent talks in my parish called, I think it's called What is Justice? You can find them on our social media, on Spotify. And one of them was with there are a couple of speakers from the US, including Kelly Brown Douglas and Dion, Bishop Dion from Missouri, and various others. And Elizabeth did one of these, and we had a really interesting conversation about allyship. And I want to just touch on allyship today. And Elizabeth really does not like allyship. So she said, I really don't like the word allyship. And I thought it was very interesting, so we dug into it. And it was actually one of those moments, we've done the podcast, and then she said back, and we think, we've got to do that. So we went back and we talked about what's the problem with allyship. And often we think about allyship as people who are kind of standing alongside people who are facing some form of oppression and in many ways advocating for them. And what Elizabeth was saying, and I don't want to misrepresent it, so do go listen to the podcast, but what Elizabeth, I think, was saying is not so much she had a problem with advocacy, that in fact was very much in favour of advocacy. But the problem with allyship is that it sometimes makes the people who are being oppressed the problem. i.e., I'm your ally because I'll come and help you with the problem that you have. So the problem that you have is that you're a queer person. The problem that you have is that you're a black person. The problem that you have is that you're a woman, or whatever particular form of oppression is we're facing. And she said that actually, in many ways, that keeps the power in the hands of the ally. So the ally does not actually give up the power to the ally. Says, I have the power, I'm going to come and help you and bring you up. And therefore, in many ways, is a key to becoming more virtuous. Because you are helping someone else, that makes you a good person. Which is very interesting perspective, something I suppose I thought about it, never really put into words before. And so it comes to this concept, I'm going to help you with your problem. And so her main area of advocacy is in racial justice. So she described it as she said, I'm going to help you, but when people come and ally for her, I'm going to help you because your blackness is the problem, rather than because systemic racial injustice is the problem. And we can see the same thing in this context. Actually, the issue here is the injustice in society, rather than the person in front of you who seems to have a problem. And it's how we situate ourselves. And again, that comes back to the importance of the theological here, which is that if you start with the Imago Dei, if you start with the image of God, then the image of God is the criteria against which we find out what the problem is. So if we say that queer people are made in the likeness and image of God, then the queerness is not the issue. And so on through all these different things. And she said, one of the problems that she faces is that people say to her, you're the one with the problem. You've got a chip on your shoulder. You don't stop going on about race. And I have the same thing, not about race so much, but about queerness in my context. I remember standing in a church meeting and talking about how I felt that the church was not really. It was in, I think, 2013, something like that, and the bishops of the Church of England had decided in their wisdom to release a report saying that they didn't like gay people in a nice way. They liked them, but they didn't really want to marry them, and if they could just be quiet, that'd be better. And they released it on Valentine's Day, which I just thought was the most fabulous thing. And actually, on the Church of England website, they changed the date at the top to the 15th rather than the 14th, or this sort of birthday, which I just thought was a sort of extraordinary act of stupidity from the Church of England. But in this meeting, I remember standing up and saying, this is unacceptable and so on. I was angry and upset, and I was quite young then. I was quite young then. And I was a bit hot-headed perhaps, but I wasn't rude. I stood up and I think I said something along the lines of, what do you people think we do? What do you think, there was talk about the gay lifestyle. I said, what do you think we get up to? Like, what is it? Is it the drugs? Is it the drink? What is it that you think we do on a day-by-day basis that makes our lives so exciting that you have to shut them down? What is it? It was something like that. It wasn't much more, it was sort of as grumpy as that. And someone then stood up afterwards, pushed his hair back like this, and went, oh, if only you would have a warmer heart and a cooler head. And that phrase has stuck with me. I think it features in this book, actually, because it annoyed me so much. But that's what we face a lot. That's those of us who advocate for ourselves as well as for other people face. We face that level of kind of calm down dear territory. And just picking up on allyship, finally, just thinking about, there's something called epistemic injustice, which is also picked up in this podcast series, which is helpful because I don't have to talk about it too much. But one of the things about epistemic injustice is who is worth listening to? Who is given the authority or the recognition that they have something to say about this particular topic? And those of us who are queer are often told we cannot speak about this level-headedly because it impacts us too much. And that's consistent. that happens all the time. That actually, you can't talk about this. This is all about you wanting to get married. So therefore, you're not talking about this theology. I'm just reading Karen Keen's book on the possibility of same-sex relationships, and she talks about this. People saying to her, you're just talking about this, you just changed your mind because you want to get married. That's what it's all about. You're just switching scripture around. How you want to. We need people who are genuine advocates. I think advocate is better than ally, possibly, to speak about this in the same way that we do, in a dispassionate way, and actually amplify the voices of those for whom this is a real life issue, and also shut down those people when they say, this is just you trying to make scripture fit your will. This is just because you've got a hot head and you can't think about this carefully. It's just simply not the case. It's not true. To think about where we move from here, I think in the first place, one of the gifts of queer people is that we're still here. So I know in the Episcopal Church things are easier, but they're still not perfect, and they're still not perfect across the board for all kinds of different. We have the Equalities Act in England is very helpful because it has different protected characteristics, all of which are basically things that wider society has managed to get wrong. So amongst those are people who have, women, a minority issue, a fascinating way it's described. Women being a minority issue is just the most extraordinary definition of a minority issue I've ever heard. But nonetheless, people who have been oppressed, so we have women, we have queer people of all different types, we have disabled people, people of colour and so on. So a whole group of different helpful things that we might think about. All of these people keep turning up to church, despite the fact that the church doesn't always make it entirely obvious that we want them there. And some of us have 2 or 3 of those characteristics, some of us have 1, some of us have all, and some of us have none. And those of us with none have a particular responsibility, I think, to recognise quite how amazing it is that people still turn up. I think it helps us refine and interrogate our theology. It doesn't redefine, we didn't redefine marriage. I don't think marriage has been redefined, I would reject that. I think it's been refined. I think we've actually got to the bottom, we've interrogated and understood what marriage is actually about. And I think it's developed through history, development of doctrine happens, it's happened. I much prefer marriage between people of the same sex, even if I was a conservative. I'm sure I would prefer marriage between people of the same sex than wives as property. Or marriage where you have 1 wife and 300 concubines. And we're talking about the fathers of the faith here, Solomon, Abraham. We're not talking about kind of, aberration. When I was in Notre Dame giving a talk, someone said to me, well, where's the examples of same-sex marriage in the Bible? And I said, where's the examples of really successful heterosexual marriage in the Bible? I've spoken about the margins, so actually going to the margins and sitting in the margins rather than feeling the need to bring the margins into the centre. And that includes in the Eucharistic life, where we go to the Eucharist, we don't decide, certainly in the Episcopal Church, other churches may vary, but we don't decide who's allowed to come and receive communion. And I know you're having your own debates about that, but I'll leave that there. But God is the person who sets the place at the table, not us. And so people are invited to come and sit at their place at the table, rather than at our place that we've given to them. There's a sense of honesty in coming out that queer people bring. And I think we also challenge the secular norm that we have so often baptised as Christian. So I think we've often said that this is Christian, whereas what we actually mean is this is culturally Christian. And queer people are able to tease out what we mean when we're talking about that. So, to finish, because I just 55-minute class. Queering, if you're looking for a phrase to describe it, is a complicating of the taken for granted heteronormativity of everyday practices, spaces, and discourses. I think that's a good thing. So, queering is a complication of the taken for granted heteronormativity of everyday practices, spaces, and discourses. So I think that's a rather good thing for us to be doing. I think it's a good thing for queer people. I also think it's a good thing for the church. It's a good thing for all of us who call ourselves Christians. It changes our understanding of the Eucharist, of baptism, of mission, of sex, of relationships. Imagine a world in which we took most of this stuff for granted. Where would we be in that kind of world? Where actually we were more worried about how we lived as Christian people with these, what we know to be the core tenets of Christianity's front and centre, rather than the peripheral expressions of Christianity front and centre, which we so often do. And I think as a church, and as Tech in particular, you are further along the road than we are in England, but we all have to commit ourselves to recognising that just because we marry people of the same sex or gender does not mean that we've actually done enough.